Hi everybody, we want to take a second of your time and hopefully you'll follow through because we're also going to give you a little history lesson, but we wanted to take a second of your time to remind you that we are offering a couple of sessions on the Bill of Rights. It's a part of our Civics 101 series, which we covered Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of the Constitution, and now we've moved on to the Bill of Rights. So we'll be doing that in two parts. So April 1st and April 15th, we'll have two parts on the Bill of Rights. We hope that you'll visit us at unlockyoureducation.com and you'll sign up and register. The cost is super low. For two sessions at an hour apiece, it's $8 for the sessions. Or if you want to purchase the whole series, it's $18. We've moved on, so you get the first sessions, the first three sessions recorded, and we'll deliver those to you via our online classroom. Hope you sign up at www.unlockyoureducation.com. So we're going to move right into a little bit of history lesson. This history lesson is important, and why we talk about it with such things as the Bill of Rights is that it is on March 24th, 1765, that an Act of Parliament is passed. It's passed, and it's called the Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act of 1765 obviously is about what to do with British troops that are in the colonies. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, so hold on tight. Here we go. Understand why the Quartering Act of 1765 is important, you really have to have a little bit of background on what's happening in the colonies beforehand. And we're not going to do a whole lot of history here because I think it's important that the French and Indian War has its own series or its own lesson plan on why it's important. So we're just going to do a little bit of background. There's so much more. It's such a rich time of history, and most historians would agree that it's the French and Indian War that actually leads to the American Revolution. It's that first step that really proves that the American Revolution is inevitable, and it's in that French and Indian War. But the French and Indian War is fought between 1754 and until 1763 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. What happens basically is there's this great expansion of British territory in the New World. The French are basically leave the entire North American New World, and the British take over most of that land. And so you also have a problem that occurs, in that the British start to recognize that carrying and maintaining these colonies in North America has cost them great amount of money, and the French and Indian War particularly has indebted them greatly. And so when they're looking at that and they realize there's so much money we owe back for this, where they look is, well, the colonies didn't do enough. They're starting to feel a sense of resentment for the colonists, who they believe did not do enough to help with the French and Indian War. So their idea here is they're going to pass the cost, that debt, along to those colonists. And so they generate substantial resentment. There's debt to be repaid. The British start introducing a series of acts out of Parliament that basically raise funds and want to ensure loyalty from the colonies. On the other side of the equation, you have the colonists, who learn some things about themselves and learn some things about the British and learn some things about North America. The first thing they learned is, hey, when we're given an opportunity to unite together, the 13 colonies can actually unite together to fight a common enemy. In this case, it's the French. And so you have these colonies coming together, working with the British, but in this case, there's several battles that the colonists are responsible for merging together and actually fighting against the French and defeating a common enemy. The second thing they learned is that with the expansion to the west that they see the British get all of this land. They realize there is so much more that we can get to the west. And so they start setting their eyes to the west, and they start realizing that there's great wealth in the west. And so if they were able to move, if they were able to take their population out of this very cramped area in the East Coast and move it west, that would help them, that would allow them to have land, and it would allow them to have wealth. Land equals wealth at this point. Not only does land equal wealth, but the French know that we also know that the French were responsible for a large fur trade. So you start looking and going, there's some wealth involved, and the colonists start to see that. But they also see a problem. Because of the fear of entanglement with Native American tribes, the British say, no, you cannot move westward. You're stuck where you're at. We cannot afford any more protracted fights with the Native Americans in North America. We also have a problem because we have debt. So you have to listen to what we're saying. The colonists also now start to see that the British may not have the colony's best interest in mind all of the time. So when the colonists start to see west, the British say no. That starts to spark some issues with the colonists toward the British Empire, and so that's all controlled. These are the important pieces. What happens after the French Indian War is all of these intolerable acts. You have things like the Sugar Act. You have things like the Stamp Act. You have all of these things that are happening, and you start to realize that the British are going to be more hands-on with their colonies. They're going to force the colonies to be a part of the British Empire. They're going to force the colonies to pay a larger percentage in taxes. So that presents a problem, and we're going to talk about one of the very first things that they see. Just a moment. In Parliament right now, you have several reasons that the Quartering Act becomes important. The very first reason was, hey, we need to protect these colonies. We think we understand that this is just a empire protecting the colonies, but in Parliament, there's also some other reasons. That protection that they say they're giving to the colonists may not have been altruistic. It may not have been the ideal. The second reason, and much more likely, but is more complicated, was the crown is in debt. We know that there's huge debt. We also understand that with that debt, to ship all of those troops back after the French and Indian War, it's going to cost more money. And so there's this understanding that if we leave these troops in North America, there's some benefit. The first benefit is we don't have the cost of shipping them back to the British island. The second benefit is if we ship all of these British troops back to the British island, we have a problem with what to do with them once they get home. Right? So we know that British troops, especially people of noble birth, they'll volunteer to be a part of the army. They are guaranteed that when they come home, they will be given positions of nobility, positions of title, and they don't have that. It's just not available to them. So what do you do with them? Well, the answer here for James Grenville and then King George III, obviously, is let's leave them in North America. Let's couch it in the idea that we're there to protect the colonies. The third reason that they say is we also need to keep an eye on these colonists who started to realize that there could be grounds or movement toward hostilities with Britain itself, and the best way to make sure that doesn't happen is by presenting an armed force there to keep them from getting out of loyalty, out of favor with the crown. And so these are the three reasons you really see the movement for the Quartering Act. They start to say, well, we have all of these troops, we have to do something with them. And so the Quartering Act basically is when you sign up to be a part of the British Army, you're promised that you will be housed, that you will be fed, that you will receive, yes, there is actually a beer allowance or an ale allowance that you receive when you become a troop in the British military. Whether that's the Navy, Army, it doesn't matter. There's certain promises that are made that you will be quartered, that you will receive food and drink. So that starts the problem is we have all of these troops in North America. What are we going to do with them? So that brings us to what the Quartering Act of 1765 is and what it is not. What it is and what it does say is that since we have a promise in place to take care of, to house, to feed, and to give drink to our troops, we will make sure that happens in the colonies. The problem here is you have a large force of French and Indian War veterans that are in the colonies that are now the responsibility of the crown in North America to make sure that they're housed and that they're fed. What do you do with them? How do you do that? Well, the Quartering Act of 1765 it starts this process of moving toward a more involved British Crown. They pass that and they say it's the responsibility of the colonies to pay for the barracks, to pay for the food, and to pay for the drink of these troops, because they're there. Remember, they're saying they're there to protect the colonists. In truth, what we know is that may not be the fact, but that cost is being passed on. So what does the act say? Unlike what we always thought it said, it does not give permission for troops to remove British citizens from their house. It does not allow them to displace British citizens. It does not allow them to simply take over houses that are owned by British citizens. So that's oftentimes what we hear is, hey, the Third Amendment comes about because of the Quartering Act of 1765. Again, that's the plug for the Bill of Rights. The Third Amendment says that, hey, you have to house troops in a certain way. You can't do this in private citizens. So it all comes from this idea of the Quartering Act, because in the Quartering Act, what it does say is that the colonies had to supply barracks, which means paying for them, building them, using their resources for them. If there weren't barracks available, the troops would be housed in inns or stables or alehouses, taverns or victualling houses, which is basically restaurants, and the houses of sellers of wine. So basically what you're seeing is this idea that you will be engaged in barracking or housing these troops, and if you can't do that in a barracks, you will do that with public businesses that reach out to the public, provide housing and food already, so it's easy for these troops to find housing and food at these places. That's what the Quartering Act basically says. The colonists, though, feel like, and this is where we get this from, is they feel like this is an infringement. They feel like this is something that they don't want. If you're a colonist at this point, you're saying, well, we don't even want the troops here. And now we have to pay for their housing. We have to pay for their food. We have to pay for their drinks. And so the colonists are saying to the parliament, that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable that we're paying for this. If you want them here, you pay for it. And so it starts this road toward the revolution. It's also feared during this time that these acts of parliament would ultimately lead to further acts. So if I allow you to have the Quartering Act of 1765, what's to stop you from placing taxes on stamps or tea or... You got it. It did. It led to those things. We have the Stamp Act. We have the all of the Townshend Acts. All of those things did happen. The Quartering Act of 1765, though, is not the right to house in any citizen's home. Remember that. So oftentimes we forget that in history we put our own spin on it. The truth is here, it's not the displacement of British citizens. It is actually forcing colonists to be a part of the British Empire. And they use that to say, we think you're infringing on us. We don't want these troops here. We care for our own protection, and we can handle that ourselves. Please take your troops home. So that's kind of the Quartering Act, which was passed on this day in 1765.